Great. Thank you so much, Bridger. And thank you everyone for taking time out on your Tuesday to come and listen to me give a talk on hopefully a topic you don't really know too much about, but I hope by the end of this you'll know a little bit more about one of the world's rarest whale populations. Let me share my screen. All right, got the thumbs up. So just starting off with a little bit of introduction for those who are unaware, right whales are a large baleen whale. They can grow to be approximately 50 to 60 feet long. So here's the right whale on a size chart showing the size of a right whale relative to other species. And here it is compared to a human. So right whales are filter feeders. They eat zooplankton or tiny shrimp and krill, predominantly a species called a copepod, which is a little critter you see there in the corner. And so one of the ways that we can tell right whales apart is through what are called callosities. So you see all those bumps that are on the top of their head. Those are called callosities, and those are just raised patches of roughened skin. They can be white, sometimes orange or dark in color. And these patterns are unique to each individual whale. So it's like their footprint or similar to a humpback whale fluke. And so if you look at all four of these photos, you can see, each pattern is different on each of the whales. And so we can then compare photos of a whale to a catalog of known individuals, compare those patterns, and then that's how we can tell whether we're looking at a new animal. We can track individuals over time. We can start getting ideas of recite rates, population trends. And a fun fact for those who don't know, callosities are white or yellow because they're actually covered in cyanids or whale lice, and they just they're sitting on top and eating all those dead skin patches. So there are three different species of right whales. The North Atlantic is the most commonly known of the right whales. They occur along the east coast of the US. The southern right whale spans across the Southern Ocean. And then the North Pacific right whale, which is the one I'm going to be talking about here tonight. And those are obviously found in the North Pacific. So North Pacific right whales are separated into two different populations. You have the Western population, which is found primarily in Japanese and Russian waters. And then the Eastern population, which is found along the coast of US, Canada, and even as far as Mexico. And studies have found that these two populations are genetically distinct. So if there is some spatial overlap in their distribution, it doesn't appear as though they're interbreeding. And the Western population is thought to number somewhere in the low hundreds, maybe around 300 or 400 animals. But the Eastern population is the one that I'm going to be focusing on for this talk. So right whales were once widely distributed throughout the entire Bering Sea in the North Pacific. Unfortunately, they then became the primary target of commercial whaling in the 1800s. And so these maps show all of the right whale takes from 1839 to 1904. And it's estimated that somewhere between 26 and 37,000 animals were taken, with the majority of that happening in just a couple of decades. And so this brought the population down to what we think were somewhere in the high hundreds. And it was thought that the population might be beginning to recover, but then the Soviets began illegally whaling in the early 1960s. And in just a few years, they took over 700 additional animals, and this just decimated what was left of the Eastern population. So to get an abundance estimate, NOAA began conducting surveys in the Bering Sea. And from those data, they found that the population size was estimated at only about 30 animals. Of that, only 8 were females. And they have a 3-to-1 male biased sex ratio, which unfortunately is the opposite ratio you want when you're trying to rebuild a population. And although these results are specific to the Bering Sea, the infrequent sightings outside of this area suggest that the overall population size is likely fewer than 50 animals. So there are about as many people on this Zoom call tonight as there are animals remaining in the eastern right whale population. So they are unfortunately very much facing extinction, potentially within our lifetime. So, because of this, NOAA designated two areas in the southeastern Bering Sea and in the Gulf of Alaska as critical habitat in 2008. So, we know that we can find these animals in these areas in the summer. It's their summer feeding grounds. They're there every year. But what we don't know is where these animals go when or even if they leave their feeding grounds. Their migration routes and their calving grounds are still unknown. We do suspect they migrate south, much like a lot of your other large whale species, and this is supported by our sighting data. So we have had one high to low latitude match of a right whale that was first seen in Hawaii in April of 1996 that was resighted later that year in the Bering Sea in July. And then we had another animal in 2001 in June off British Columbia that was then later resighted off Kodiak in August of that same year. However, these are still the only two instances of a high to low latitude match of a right whale. So it's difficult to be able to make any kind of determination on migration routes with only an N of 2. And then interestingly, in almost 40 years of photo ID data collection, we've never matched an individual from the Bering Sea to the Gulf of Alaska. And so, because of this, we suspect that this population may be comprised of two different subgroups, but unfortunately, it's still hypothesis at this point. And then we had two right whales that were sighted by some cod fishermen just northeast of Unimak Pass in the Aleutian Island chain in February of 2022. And so this was a really fantastic sighting for a lot of reasons. Not only is it the first visually confirmed sighting of right whales feeding over winter in the Bering Sea, but it also suggests that at least some portion of the population might be overwintering there and not migrating south. Unfortunately, the video quality wasn't good enough for us to match individuals based on those callosities. So we don't know if these are known animals and matched to our catalog or not, but it was still a really fantastic sighting. So you might be thinking, well, hey, why not put a satellite tag on these animals to track their movements? You know, it's been really successful with other species of large whales. And we did that in 2004 and again in 2008 and 2009. And while we did successfully tag several animals, and we got a lot of amazing data on fine scale habitat use, unfortunately, all of the tags fell out before the animals left the Bering Sea. So it still left that question of their migratory routes unanswered. So, why do we still know so little about these animals? Why is it so difficult to study them? So, I like to start with a comparison for the Atlantic right whale. So that's the more commonly known of the U.S. right whale species. For better or worse, their migratory route is along the entire U.S. East Coast. So at any given time of the year, you can head to somewhere along the East Coast and see right whales. So because of that, they're an extremely well studied and well known population because of their accessibility. They know how many animals there are, who's reproducing, who's not, who's been killed. Unfortunately, for our population, they're not the least bit easy to access. To start, it's a full day steam to their high density area from the nearest port, which is Dutch Harbor. It's highlighted by that yellow star. And the Bering Sea is not known for nice weather. It can be downright grumpy at the best times. This is actual footage from one of our right whale surveys that I was on. And imagine, trying to find anything in this in this situation, let alone a whale that likes to hide. So even if we're on dedicated right whale surveys, we have acoustics that we can use to find them. These animals are really, really difficult to find. So I like to kind of break it down by the numbers. So I've been going to Alaska every summer for 14 years, minus 1 year because of COVID. And that amounts to a total of 637 days in Alaskan waters. And if we reduce that down to those that were in the Bering and the Gulf of Alaska, which is their historical distribution grounds, 504 days. And of those 504 days, I have seen right whales on a whopping 24. And for those who don't like math, that's about 4.7%. So that's one of the big struggles. These are the proverbial needle in a very large haystack. You know, we went 5 years on our NOAA sighting surveys without a single sighting. And of those 24 days, I've been in their presence for all of 74 hours and 45 minutes or so, give or take, which is the equivalent of 3.1 days out of 14 years. And then, unfortunately, it gets worse. So because you're dealing with the survivors of a population that was taken out by whaling, whenever a vessel gets near them, their behavior becomes erratic. They flee, they stop calling, they become visually cryptic. And so even if you find a right whale, oftentimes the photos that you get are a useless low profile photo. You're in a thick fog bank, or my personal favorite, it's the back of the animal as it swims away. So, you know, this is you're dealing with 50 odd animals in an area that's larger than the size of the entire state of California, just in the Bering Sea alone. So, how do you study a population that has so few animals? You can't find them, you don't know where they go. Well, the best way we can do that is using passive acoustics. So, one of the best things about right whales is they are highly vocal. And so that makes them a really great candidate for passive acoustic monitoring. And so, right whales make predominantly three call types. The first is a gunshot. And I'm going to ask you to bear with me here because in order for you to hear the audio, I have to stop sharing and reshare. So, hang on for just a second. Okay, and the second call type in the bottom left is called an up call. All right, hopefully you heard that. It's a little bit quieter. It was like, woo. Yep, great. And this last one on the bottom right, they make a variety of kind of more tonal calls and moans. All right, bear with me one more time while I reshare so you can hear me. Okay, Oop, backing up. So luckily, like I said, right whales they're highly vocal. That makes them really great candidates for passive acoustic monitoring. And so when we are out at sea, we will listen in real time to try and find right whales. And so we use an instrument called a sonobuoy. You deploy it over the side while the vessel's underway, and it floats in the water with hydrophones hanging down, and then it will transmit in real time any sounds that are occurring. And it uses VHF radio waves. And so it'll transmit back to a receiver on the vessel. So if a whale starts calling, we can hear it in real time as it happens. And the other great thing is that sonobuoys have directional capabilities. So if we start hearing a right whale, if we hear those gunshot calls, we can deploy multiple sonobuoys at once. And so here you can see I've got these two horizontal bars here. These are spectrograms of right whale calls. These are gunshots coming in at two different sonobuoys simultaneously. And so then we can plot the bearing from that sonobuoy to the call, and then we can actually localize and triangulate on the whale's position. And we can lead the boat to that position where hopefully our observers will spot the animal and then we'll be able to start working it. And so these instruments have been really crucial in helping us increase our number of right whale sightings during our surveys. But the real bread and butter of our research is our long-term passive acoustic monitoring. At the Marine Mammal Lab, we've been deploying long-term acoustic recorders at over 20 sites throughout Alaska, starting in 2007. These instruments will record to an internal hard drive for a full year, and then we can retrieve them a year later. We analyze the data, and then just by listening to the species and the sounds that we hear, we can actually determine what species are present, their migration and movement patterns, whether their distribution and those patterns are changing. So this has been a really useful tool for population monitoring, primarily because these can stay out year round when vessel surveys aren't possible. These are recording all year, whether it's covered in ice or bad weather. So it's a really fantastic way to be able to monitor year round when we can't be up there. So I want to go through some of the results from our long-term monitoring. So I'm going to start here. This plot shows right whale calling presence over 2 years at a single location. And so we have September of 2014 going through to September of 2016 with time on your x-axis. And then the black vertical bars are calling presence, defined as the percentage of 10-minute intervals with calls per day. So 100% calling activity would mean that every 10-minute increment of recordings for that day had at least one right whale call. And then the blue line you're seeing is ice concentration, and any gray sections is where we don't have data. And so what you can see is we've got really nice right whale calling presence in the summer months and at this one location, which is in their right whale critical habitat. But now we can zoom out and include multiple moorings and years. And so now this plot is showing 9 locations over the 6 years. I've color coded them to the map on the left, and I've arranged them latitudinally so you can kind of get an idea of north to south. And so this is a really nice example of a long-term time series of acoustic detections of right whales throughout the entire Bering Sea. What you'll notice is we've got really consistent annual detections of right whales in the summer months in the southeastern Bering Sea, particularly in their critical habitat. But we're also starting to see an uptick in detections at our northern Bering Sea moorings as well in recent years that we think might be due to oceanographic conditions, but I'm going to get back to that, so hold on. But of course, like all things with right whales, there are complications. So I mentioned right whales make those gunshot calls that you heard and up calls. So we were sent this spectrogram from one of our colleagues and we said, yeah, it's a right whale gunshot. And she said, nope, that's from a bowhead off Utqiagvik or Barrow. And so come to find out, bowheads also make both gunshot and up calls. And they are almost impossible to distinguish between right whales spectrographically or aurally. And so this plot here is from one of our northern Bering Sea recorders. It shows about 4 minutes of recordings, and it's mid-March when this location is completely 100% covered in ice. And most of the calls that you see on the spectrogram are bowhead song, but right in the middle of all of that are 3 textbook right whale up calls. So were these right whales or were they bowheads? That's one of our big questions. And so if you go back to our plot of our long-term detections, all of these right whale detections occurred under the ice in winter when bowhead whales were also present. And so for right now, we just have to label all of these as ambiguous or maybe because we don't know yet whether they were produced by right whales or bowheads. But one of the ways that we're hoping to be able to distinguish them is using song. So interestingly, our small little population of right whales has been found to sing. much like humpback whales. Although with humpbacks and bowhead whales, their calls are much more melodious and tonal and, sound like something you'd hear on an Enya CD. Right whale song is comprised almost entirely of that gunshot call. And so it's the number and the spacing and the timing of those gunshots that are repeated over and over in a very regular stereotyped manner that constitutes song. And so far, bowheads have not been found to make songs out of gunshots. They make songs out of tonal calls. So this might be one way if we do see gunshots over winter when both species might be present, if they are occurring in pattern or in song, that's a pretty clear indication that we might have right whales. This also, interestingly, has not yet been documented in any other population of right whales. It hasn't been found yet in Atlantic or Southern. And so I find it fascinating that the smallest and most critically endangered of right whale populations is the one that's been documented singing. So shifting tactics a little bit, we are often asked, why haven't these animals recovered? Why hasn't the population rebounded? Well, it's $1 million question. If I find out, I'll be sure to let you know. They've been protected since the 1970s. Many other populations of marine mammals have recovered from similarly low numbers in that amount of time, but we don't have evidence yet that this population has recovered. Well, if you think about it, since 2004, only 4 known females have been resighted. And granted, there are a lot of sightings for which the sex of the animal is unknown, but remember that there were only an estimated 8 females from the population abundance estimate. And we were able to collect 6 new biopsy samples in 2 different years, and all were from animals of previously unknown sex. And unfortunately, 5 of them ended up being males with only 1 female. So while it's fantastic that we did have a female, that suggests that maybe the population is even more skewed towards males than we currently think. And unfortunately, we also have not seen a calf in the Bering Sea or the Gulf of Alaska since 2004. And even if you go into the old whaling logbooks, the old whaling catchers, they say that there's no evidence that they found calving grounds in the North Pacific. And yet we still have had a few sightings of non-adults. We had a subadult in the Gulf of Alaska in 2005, another one off British Columbia in 2013, and most recently, a juvenile was seen in the Bering Sea in 2017. Now, these animals were all calves at one point, so this begs the question, where are the cow-calf pairs? Are there just very few, or are they potentially in an area that we don't know about yet and haven't surveyed? That's, again, one of the many questions that we're trying to figure out with these guys. This population does also face a lot of threats that could be hindering their recovery. Entanglement is one of the biggest. Alaska does have the largest fisheries in the country by volume, with pot fisheries for crab and several finfish species. And although there are only 2 animals in our catalog with known entanglement scars, the rarity of sightings combined with the extremely remote location means that it's unlikely that an animal that is entangled would be sighted and reported before it dies. So unfortunately, it is the overlap is huge between the 2, but we haven't been able to quantify the actual impacts to the population because we have so few animals with scars. This is, however, been documented pretty extensively in Western right whales. So you can see in the video on the left, these are, it's footage of 3 right whales, and you can see those white scars on the back. And again, down here hopefully you can see my mouse. And down by the tailstock there, those are classic entanglement scars, similar to what you see in the Atlantic population. And then the animal on the right this was an animal that was entangled in aquaculture gear in Korea, entangled up in all those floats. And not only that, this has also been documented for bowhead whales who come down into the Bering Sea in winter. They do overlap with right whales. So again, the overlap and the potential for entanglements is really quite high. We just haven't been able to quantify it. Are they not getting entangled, or are they getting entangled and dying before we know? So another big threat is vessel strikes. So this map is a density map showing all vessel traffic in 2022, along with vessels that are currently in transit as of yesterday afternoon when I took this plot. So the Great Circle route for commercial shipping runs right through an area called Unimac Pass, which is highlighted by that black star there. And we think that this is one of the primary passes that right whales may be using when migrating in between, the Bering Sea and other locations. And then when you look at, this is our same plot of our right whale calling, but now it's overlaid with vessel noise in orange. And it does paint a fairly bleak picture here. There's huge overlap between right whales and vessels, both in their critical habitat. This bottom row here, UN1, that is that Unimac Pass that I showed you about. And so while right whale detections are infrequent, every day, except for I think 2, had considerable vessel noise. So, but again, like with entanglements, we don't have any animals in our catalog that have ship strike scars. We haven't had any records or reports of whales being struck. So are they not getting struck, or are they getting struck but not being reported or not being seen? So another kind of more indirect threat, I'm often asked how climate change is impacting this population. And we're still trying to fully understand all the impacts of a warming Arctic on this population. There are a few trends that we can look at. So the map on the left shows the overall temperature change across the world in the last 50 years compared to the baseline. And it really highlights how badly the Arctic is impacted and how much it has warmed in recent years. And the right-hand plot shows the change in sea ice cover relative to that average. So that dashed line represents the baseline, and you can see the sharp decline that we've seen in sea ice extent since 2012. So how does this impact right whales? So studies have shown that the warming temperatures and an earlier retreat of sea ice in the Bering Sea is actually resulting in a decrease in abundance of really large lipid-rich zooplankton, which are the primary prey of right whales. So this plot here is showing the changes in abundance of different zooplankton in the northern Bering, which is the left side, and the southern Bering on the right side. And so really the one I want you to focus on is the center plots that are outlined in red. These are your large copepods, which is the critter you see on the left. It's the primary food source for right whales. Well, if you look at this through the lens of these warm and cold year stanzas, you can see that in the warm years, that results in fewer of those large copepods throughout the entire Bering Sea, and it tends to favor smaller, less lipid-rich copepods. And then this correlates really well with the work that my colleague, Dr. Dana Wright, has done to model zooplankton. And what she's finding is that in years with colder bottom temperatures, those copepods are abundant in that really dense cold water in their critical habitat. But her results found that the copepods will shift north as the sea ice continues to decline and sea temperatures increase. And so this suggests also that there will be a similar northward shift in right whale distribution as they continue to target those prey. And this is supported by our acoustic data. So going back to that long-term plot, here it is now seen through the lens of those cold and warm years. And you can see that generally those years where we had those warmer temperatures were those years where we had more acoustic detections in the northern Bering. And so this corresponds really well with Dana's results and with our acoustic results that's showing we could be seeing a northward shift in right whale distribution as their prey are likewise moving farther north. So that's it's hard to kind of paint a happy picture about this population. But all that said, there is still quite a bit of hope with these animals. they're resilient, they're survivors. And I do want to kind of end my last little bit here by talking about how to identify them. Um, every animal that we see is nice and big, they're robust, they're healthy. But to identify them, you've got they're they have a really wide, flat back with no dorsal fin. They have those callosities that I mentioned earlier, those white bumps on their head. They make a really distinctive V-shaped blow. Their flukes are really wide. They're almost as wide as like a third the length of their body. So really big flukes with a really nice distinctive V in the notch. And then they have this really interesting kind of paddle-shaped pectoral fin. So if you see any of these things, you might be seeing a right whale. And I always like to tell people, if you see a whale and you think, well, that's kind of a funny looking gray whale or humpback whale, odds are it might not be. And I always have to kind of stress how you identify them and why it's so important, because this is a photo of a right whale that was seen off La Jolla in April of 2017. It's a beautiful shot of a right whale, the pectoral fin kind of lounging at the surface. Well, this is the whole photo that was aired during the local news. And this animal was originally identified as a gray whale. And it wasn't until aerial photos and drone footage surfaced around social media about a week later that it was correctly identified as a right whale. But unfortunately, by that time, the whale had left the area, so we weren't able to get any clear photo ID shots. So, this begs the question, how many other right whale sightings are out there? How many others have potentially been misidentified? Perhaps with more public awareness and more correct identifications, we may get more reports, more sightings outside of their known feeding grounds. And these are really crucial in helping us kind of put more pieces to that puzzle of where these animals are going and what their migratory routes are. And so I'm just going to wrap up by mentioning what to do if you happen to see a right whale. They have been seen off the coast of Washington. Sightings are increasing off the coast of California in recent years. So it's certainly not outside the realm of possibility that you guys might see a right whale at some point. Obviously, follow the regulations for the animal safety, slow your speed, stay 500 meters away. If you can, take photos and video. This is kind of an ideal photo here. It shows the side of the head with that pattern of callosities, but any photo or video would be really helpful. It helps us confirm species. And please, please let us know. We love getting reports and sightings. We have a sighting email, np.rw@noaa.gov. You can email me. That's my cell phone. Helpful things to note are obviously the date and the time, the location, number of animals, if known, their behavior. Even if you aren't sure if it's a right whale, let us know. We would much rather have a bunch of false positives than miss a possible sighting. And we really do rely quite heavily on these opportunistic reports from people. So I very much encourage you to keep right whales in mind if you're ever out on the water. And I'm a little bit ahead of time, I think. I'm just going to end briefly and say it's very true. It takes a village, and my village is not only large, it is fantastic. So I have to thank all of my collaborators and coworkers, our funding agencies. I will take questions, and I'm going to end on this slide one last time just to give you guys a little more time to write down important emails.
Thank you. It's amazing how elusive and fascinating these creatures are. And yeah, I'm glad we got to learn a little bit about it. Looks like some questions are rolling in.
Great. Yeah. I didn't have time to go into everything. So yeah, I love getting questions. Fire away.
So Tuck Stebbins is wondering what the useful range is of the two acoustic sensors. And I guess, I don't know if this is where he's headed, but I'm curious. Do you have them set up in a way that their ranges overlap and you feel like you have a really good picture of an entire area?
Great questions. So for the sonobuoys, which is the instrument that we use in real time when we're out at sea, I have detected and been able to localize on a right whale as far away as about 40 miles. That's kind of the limit of the sonobuoys. For our long-term recorders, we suspect it's probably a max of about the same on average, probably 30 miles. But they are too far apart to be able to get the same whale calling on both. So while we are able to track kind of movement and distribution and occurrence, we don't have an array to be able to localize on animals using our long-term data.
And then you mentioned that really distinct V-shaped blow. Is
Mhm.
that are they the only whale? Is that like a surefire smoking gun identifier?
Ooh, yes and no. They really are the only whale that makes a perfect V. But the reason I say no is because it's very difficult to identify whales just by the blow. If you're off axis, if it's windy, then that blow can get distorted very, very quickly. But if it's a calm day and you're kind of looking right down the back and you see a V, that's a pretty clear indicator. Because the closest species with a similar blow is a gray whale, and they make kind of a heart shaped
Hmm.
blow. It's a little bit more connected down at the bottom.
Let's see. We have a question about the birth rate
Mhm.
and the years that calves stay with mothers of right whales.
So, what we know about kind of birthing and calving rates is all based on the Atlantic population because unfortunately we have had very, very few calves with our population. They are thought to have calves around every 3 to 4 years, and calves stay with the mom for, I believe, about a year and a half, I think.
And you said the populations are distinct genetically, but
Mhm.
they're close enough that the comparisons are probably accurate. Is that safe to say?
It is, yeah. Every time we have a right whale sighting, we do compare it with the images that we have for the catalog of Western right whales, and we think there might be some overlap up in the Bering Sea where the Western and the Eastern kind of come together. Um, but so far, yeah, they are genetically distinct. So if there is any overlap there, then they're not interbreeding. No.
And then why are they called right whales, not wrong whales?
Not wrong whales, not left whales. They are called the right whale because they were the right whale to kill. Unfortunately, they are slow moving. They are very fat. They have a lot of blubber, and they float when they're killed. So they were the ideal target for commercial whaling.
Hmm. And so was their plight significantly worse than other whales at the time then? Is that I did wonder as you were kind of laying out the initial story if that was why they took such a hit.
It's There were quite a few taken, but the same can be said for a lot of the species of large whale. Sperm whales were taken, humpbacks, blues. They commercial whaling targeted quite a few species. A lot of them have recovered, and so that's one of the big questions: is these other populations and species have, why hasn't this one?
And then we have a question about the spots, and I wrote down the word because it was a cool word, callosity.
Callosities, yeah.
Yeah, the callosities.
Mhm.
Um, and Tink was wondering, do their spots hurt or itch? Are they bad for the whales in any way, or is that just a symbiotic
No, it is
relationship?
yep, completely symbiotic. When calves are born, they start kind of getting those rough patches. I think at just a couple months old, and then by 6 months, the pattern is pretty well established, and then that's it. Yeah.
And the lice, you said the spots are static at that point. The lice don't
Mhm.
grow and spread, and they just find a balance.
Yeah. They find a balance. Yeah. But sometimes, you can have photos of the same whale where one year they've got a lot of cyamids and one year they don't. So those callosities will look different in color. So you can't always just look at two photos and say, oh, that one's white and that one's dark. They're different animals, because it could just be that the cyamids are less abundant at that time.
And then, yeah, we also have a question about lifespan. You said they're calving every 3 to 4 years. That makes me think their lifespan might be pretty long.
It is, absolutely. So we suspect they can live to be at least 70 or 80 years old. We don't really know what the upper end is. They are very similar genetically to the bowhead whale, and bowheads have been found to live to be almost 200 years old. So it is entirely possible that these animals can live for quite a long time.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy.
Well, let's see. That was the last question in the chat. I have a couple other, yeah,
Great.
curiosities. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, folks can feel free to add as we go. But I always like to know, in the case of someone like yourself who's devoted, 14 years of field time and gone 5 years without seeing one of these creatures, kind of what keeps you going and what got you into this in the first place? Because it's such a cool thing, but hyper specific. And so as a generalist, I
Yeah.
always like to ask.
It is a bit specific. It's funny. My first field season out in 2009, we found, I think, 7 unique right whales that year, and everyone was going crazy, and it was so exciting. And everything was new to me at that point, and so I just thought they were excited about whales because I was excited about whales. And it wasn't until I got back and kind of started researching everything, and because my first field season was, I think, like a month after I started, and then I realized how rare and endangered these animals are. And then it was like, oh, that's why they were so excited, is because we just found, close to a third of the population. Um and 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 that's, I have kind of a love-hate relationship with these animals. I absolutely love them, and they make it so hard to study them. But I think that's also part of it, is the reward for when you do find them, and you find an animal and you can add a new one to the catalog, or you can get a biopsy sample and finally learn the sex of an animal that we've seen several times. It's those moments, or discovering that they sing. That was a really huge moment there. So it's doing what we can to try and help a population come back. These animals are in this situation because of human activity, so we owe it to them to do everything that we can to help them recover.
Um, and then we have a question that just popped in that says, how do you get a biopsy sample?
Another great question. So a biopsy sample is just a little piece of skin and blubber, and so we actually use a crossbow that has a little tip on it, and so you can shoot the whale. Um, and I know that sounds barbaric, but it's a very, very small. I mean, you're talking about the tip of a pencil. They don't even react when we do. So we can take that. We can just collect a little piece of skin and blubber, and from that we can determine sex, reproductive status, diet, toxins, stress levels. So really, quite a bit of information can come from that.
Stress levels. I'd love to hear
Mhm.
just a little more about that.
Yeah, it's so you can measure basically their cortisol levels, and there actually were a lot of really interesting studies after 9/11, when they shut down all shipping and planes and everything coming in and out of New York immediately after 9/11. Um, Whale stress levels dropped because of the reduction in the noise in their habitat, and they found that just through collecting all the samples where they could measure the cortisol levels. And so, yeah, it's really amazing, the things that you can learn just from a tiny little piece of skin and blubber.
And then, yeah, my last question is, you mentioned entanglements, you mentioned, yeah, vessel noise and potential vessel strikes. Is there I mean, for lack of a better phrasing, like is there a right whale lobby? Is there anyone who's trying to do policy work that would change the regulatory context and protect them from some of these things, other than just saying it's protected, you can't kill it?
Right. So before we can kind of do any legislation, we just need to have more science and more information about these guys. And so our role is to basically we're still trying to figure out just basic life history questions, where these guys are going, what they're doing. I will mention, I put it in here at the end in case someone asked. NOAA was, oops, hang on. I need to share this one. Okay. So NOAA did receive a petition to increase the critical habitat. It was received back in 2022, and it was submitted by the Center for Biological Diversity and an organization called Save the North Pacific Right Whale. And they petitioned that we increase the current critical habitat boundary to the area that you see here outlined in red. And NOAA reviewed the petition, and we worked with the managers, and we found that um, a revision to the critical habitat is warranted. And so the next step for our role is we provide basically the supporting science. So we are analyzing all of our recorders. We're collating all of the sightings data with the prey and oceanographic data to try and determine what areas might be considered critical habitat for right whales. It may not look like what they have petitioned here in yellow. It might look like something different. But yeah, so there are certain steps that are being taken. We are going to be working on revising critical habitat, but our role in the process is always just to give the science to management, and then they will handle any of the legislation part.